This is Vatican City, the world's smallest sovereign state. 49 acres in the heart of Rome, millions stand in St. Peter's Square each year and stare up at the Renaissance architecture, the soaring dome, the marble columns that stretch toward heaven. Tourists take photographs. Pilgrims kneel in prayer. Visitors marvel at the wealth, the history, the power concentrated in such a tiny space. But what none of them see, what almost no one is allowed to see, is that the most fascinating parts of the Vatican are not at street level. They are not in the Sistine Chapel or the papal apartments or even in the famous secret archives. They are below, far below. Beneath the marble floors and ancient foundations, the Vatican descends, layer after layer, century stacked upon century. And the deeper you go, the stranger it becomes. What you are looking at here is called the Vatican Grotto. Most people have never heard of it. It sits directly beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a subterranean maze of tombs and chapels where nearly 100 popes are buried. The air down here is cold. The lighting is dim. And if you are lucky enough to be granted access, you will walk past centuries of death, power, and secrecy pressed into stone. But here is what they do not tell you on the official tours. The grotto is not the bottom. It is just the beginning. Beneath the grotto lies the Scavi, an ancient Roman necropolis older than Christianity itself. And beneath that, more tunnels, more rooms. Levels that do not appear on any public map. Some say the Vatican goes down 12 stories. Others claim deeper. Workers who helped excavate sections in the 1940s reported finding chambers that were immediately sealed and never mentioned again. Archaeologists have hinted at discoveries they were ordered not to publish. And every so often someone asks the question no one at the Vatican wants to answer. What is really down there? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we are going beneath the surface. And once you see what is hidden under the most powerful religious institution on earth, you will never look at St. Peter's Square the same way again. Most visitors to St. Peter's Basilica never realize they are standing directly above a city of the dead. The Basilica itself is overwhelming. 500 years of Renaissance and Baroque grandeur designed to make you feel small, to remind you of heaven's majesty and the Church's authority. Marble everywhere, gold leaf covering surfaces that already gleam. Statues of saints frozen in eternal devotion. But all of it, every column and altar, every painted ceiling and polished floor, rests on top of something older, something hidden, the Vatican Grotto. Access to the grotto is restricted. You cannot simply wander down. Special permission is required, or you must join one of the limited tours that descend into the first subterranean level. The entrance is subtle, a staircase near the right side of the basilica that leads down into cool, dimly lit corridors. The temperature drops immediately. The air tastes different, heavier, tinged with the smell of old stone and candle wax. You are no longer in the tourist space. You are in the foundation dot. The grotto is essentially a burial vault. It stretches beneath the entire basilica, a low-ceilinged labyrinth of tombs and chapels. Nearly 100 popes are interred here, their bodies sealed behind marble slabs engraved with names, dates, and papal insignia. Some of the tombs are elaborate, small chapels with altars where priests still say private masses. Others are simple stone markers, humble resting places for pontiffs whose reigns were brief or forgettable. Walking through the grotto feels like moving through a timeline of church history, each tomb a punctuation mark in 2,000 years of doctrine, politics, and power. But the grotto is not just a graveyard. It is also a statement. These popes were buried here to establish legitimacy, to create an unbroken line from St. Peter, whose tomb supposedly lies deeper still, all the way to the present day. The message is clear. The Church is eternal, its authority unbroken, its foundation solid. Yet the deeper you walk, the more questions begin to surface. Why are some sections cordoned off? Why do certain passageways end in locked iron gates? And why, if this is merely a burial vault, does it feel like you are being watched? Tour guides stick to approved routes. They gesture toward notable tombs and recite scripted histories. Pope Pius XII, who oversaw the excavation of the necropolis during World War II. Pope John Paul II, whose tomb became a pilgrimage site almost immediately after his death. But they do not linger near the gates. They do not mention the doors that lead to other staircases, other corridors, other levels. And they certainly do not discuss what lies beneath the floor you are standing on, because the grotto is not the bottom. Beneath it, access through locked passages that require Vatican credentials most priests do not have, is the Scavi, the true necropolis. The ancient Roman cemetery that predates Christianity by centuries. That level is rarely opened to the public. Requests to visit must be made months in advance and are often denied without explanation. Only a handful of people descend there each day, and they do so under strict supervision. No photographs, no recordings, no straying from the guide. Why the secrecy? Officially, it is about preservation. The Scavi is fragile, they say. The ancient structures cannot handle large crowds. The humidity from human breath damages the frescoes. But those who have been down there describe something else. A sense of unease. Rooms that feel older than they should. Carvings that do not match Christian symbolism. And doors. So many doors, sealed, locked, leading to places the tour does not go. One archaeologist who worked on the Scavi excavation in the 1950s, speaking decades later under condition of anonymity, described finding a passage that descended far deeper than the official levels. He and his team followed it down 2 additional flights of stone stairs before being stopped by a Vatican official, who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. They were told the passage was unstable and ordered to leave immediately. The entrance was sealed with concrete the next day. When he asked what was down there, the official said only, "Nothing that concerns your work." Nothing that concerns your work. That phrase has echoed through decades of Vatican excavation projects. Workers are brought in to dig, to reinforce walls, to install lighting and ventilation, but they are rarely told why. They are given specific instructions. Excavate here, stop here, do not ask questions. And if they happen to find something unexpected, a room, a tunnel, an object that does not fit the approved narrative, they are instructed to report it and move on. What happens after that, they never learn. The grotto also contains something most people overlook. Small plaques, modest markers, some in Latin, others in Italian. They commemorate individuals who were not popes, but were deemed important. enough to be buried near them. Cardinals, bishops, a few monarchs who earned the privilege through devotion or donation. But there are also markers with no names, just dates. Some very old, some relatively recent. When asked about these, tour guides offer vague answers. Benefactors of the church, they might say, or servants whose work was known only to God. But unmarked graves in a place as controlled as the Vatican are not accidents. Every square inch of the grotto is catalogued, mapped, and maintained. If someone is buried here without a name, it is a choice. And that raises a question. Who were they, and why does the Church not want their identities known? There is also the matter of the chapels. Several small worship spaces are scattered throughout the grotto, each dedicated to a different saint or national tradition. The Irish chapel, the Polish chapel, the Lithuanian chapel. These are beautiful, intimate spaces where priests celebrate Mass in near solitude. But some of these chapels have additional doors, small, unobtrusive entrances in the back or side walls, often hidden behind altarpieces or locked behind iron grates. Where do they lead? The official answer is storage, maintenance access. But storage rooms do not require the level of security these doors have. Cameras, keypads, in some cases, guards. One priest who served at the Vatican for over a decade described accidentally discovering one of these doors unlocked late at night. He was alone, saying prayers in one of the smaller chapels, when he noticed the door slightly ajar. Curiosity won. He stepped through and found himself in a narrow corridor lined with shelves. On the shelves were boxes, wooden crates, some labeled with dates going back centuries. He did not open them. He did not have time. A security guard appeared within minutes and escorted him out without a word. The next day his superior called him in and gently reminded him that certain areas were off-limits for a reason. The conversation was polite, but the message was clear. Do not go back. Do not speak of it. The grotto is not a place of rest. It is a threshold, a reminder that the Vatican is built in layers, each one concealing the next. The tourists above see grandeur. The faithful see devotion. But those who descend even just to this first level begin to feel something else. Weight, history pressing down, secrets stacked like stones, and beneath the grotto the real descent begins. The official story begins with a death. Pope Pius XI died in February 1939, and his successor, Pius XII, wanted him buried as close to St. Peter's tomb as possible. That meant digging. The problem was no one knew exactly where St. Peter was buried, or if he was buried there at all. For centuries the Church had claimed that the first pope, martyred in Rome around 64 A.D., lay beneath the high altar of the Basilica. But it was tradition, not fact. So Pius XII authorized an excavation. What his workers found changed everything. Beneath the grotto, under centuries of papal tombs and Christian chapels, they discovered an entire Roman necropolis, a city of the dead that predated Christianity by hundreds of years. The structures were intact. Frescoes still clung to walls. Mosaics decorated floors, and inscriptions carved in Latin and Greek named families who had buried their dead here when Rome was still an empire, and Christ was just a name whispered in secret. The Scavi, as it came to be known, is not a single tomb. It is a street, a narrow ancient road lined with mausoleums built by wealthy Roman families. These were not Christians. They were pagans, merchants, soldiers, and aristocrats who purchased plots along this road because it sat on the slope of Vatican Hill, a prestigious location in ancient Rome. Each family built a small house for their dead, decorated with images of gods, mythological scenes, and symbols of eternal life as they understood it. And directly on top of this pagan cemetery, the early Christians built their first shrine to Peter, then a basilica, then the massive church that stands today. Why build a church on top of a cemetery? The answer, according to official Vatican history, is simple. Peter was buried here. The early Christians marked the spot, and later generations built over it to protect and honor the grave. But the discovery of the necropolis revealed something the Church had not emphasized. The Christian shrine was not alone. It was surrounded by pagan tombs, and in some cases the early Christians had repurposed those tombs, carving crosses into walls that once depicted Roman gods, painting Christian symbols over pagan frescoes. The transition was not clean. It was layered, improvised, and in some places rushed. Access to the Scavi is tightly controlled. You cannot simply buy a ticket. You must apply months in advance through the Vatican's excavations office, and even then, approval is not guaranteed. Only about 250 people per day are allowed down, divided into small groups that descend at staggered intervals. The tours last 90 minutes and follow a strict route. No deviation, no photography in certain areas, and absolutely no wandering off. The descent begins beneath the grotto. A narrow staircase leads down into cooler, damper air. The stone here is older. The walls are rougher. You are no longer in the polished, maintained spaces of the basilica. You are in the foundation, the original ground level of ancient Rome. The first thing you notice is the size. The mausoleums are small, barely larger than modern walk-in closets. But they are ornate. Frescoes cover the walls, faded but still visible. One depicts a chariot race. Another shows a banquet scene, the dead reclining with the gods. A third, more unsettling, shows a figure descending into the underworld, guided by a serpent. Your guide will point out the Christian elements. A small Chi symbol carved into a wall. A fish, the secret sign of early believers. But they will not linger on the pagan imagery. They will not discuss why so many of these tombs show signs of forced conversion, Christian symbols literally scratched over older carvings. And they will not mention the rooms that are not on the tour, because the official tour of the Scavi follows a single path. You walk down the ancient street, past a dozen mausoleums, and arrive at what the Church calls the tomb of St. Peter. It is a simple cavity in the wall, surrounded by graffiti in Greek and Latin from early pilgrims. The bones found here in 1968 were declared by Pope Paul VI to be Peter's, though the evidence remains contested even by Catholic scholars. But here is what the tour does not show you. The other streets, the other passages, the rooms that branch off from the main necropolis and lead deeper still. One archaeologist involved in the original excavation, writing years later in a restricted academic journal, described finding a staircase at the far end of the necropolis that descended into what appeared to be an even older structure. The stones were different, larger and more weathered. The style suggested a date centuries before the necropolis. He and his team were preparing to explore when they were stopped by a Vatican official who informed them that the area had been deemed unsafe, and further, excavation was prohibited. The staircase was sealed with concrete within days. There are other anomalies. Several of the mausoleums have back doors, small passages that lead into darkness. Some are blocked with modern brickwork, clearly sealed after the excavation began. Others are simply ignored by tour guides who steer groups past them without comment. One researcher, granted rare access to photograph the necropolis in the 1980s, reported that his camera malfunctioned in one particular mausoleum. Every photo he took in that room came out black, despite functioning perfectly everywhere else. When he asked permission to return with different equipment, his request was denied. Then there are the inscriptions. Most are standard funerary texts, naming the dead and wishing them peace. But a few are strange. One, carved into the wall of a mausoleum near the supposed tomb of Peter, reads in Latin, "What is above is also below." It is not a Christian phrase. It echoes Hermeticism, an ancient mystical tradition that predates the Church. Why would such a phrase be carved so close to the most sacred site in Catholicism? The official explanation is that it is a coincidence, a pagan inscription that happened to be nearby. But the carving is not weathered like the others. It is sharp, deliberate, and looks far newer than the surrounding stone. There is also the matter of the bones. The remains attributed to St. Peter were not found in the spot tradition claimed. They were discovered in a niche a few feet away, mixed with animal bones and construction debris. The Vatican's own archaeologist, Margherita Garducci, spent years studying the site and concluded the bones were Peter's based on a combination of forensic analysis and inscriptions. But her findings were never fully published. Key sections of her research remain classified, accessible only to Vatican-approved scholars. When journalists have asked to review the evidence, they are told it is for academic use only, and that the matter is settled. What else is down there? Workers who helped install modern lighting and ventilation in the Scavi report finding rooms that were not on any official map. One electrician, interviewed anonymously decades later, described being sent to run wiring through a narrow passage that opened into a circular chamber. The walls were lined with niches, each containing what looked like urns. But the style was wrong. Too old, too ornate. He asked his supervisor what the room was, and the supervisor told him it was not his concern, and to finish the job quickly. The room was not included in any of the public maps released later. There are also persistent rumors of a second necropolis beneath the first. Vatican records mention a deeper excavation conducted in the late 1940s and early 1950s, but no results were ever published. Requests by historians to access these records are routinely denied. One former Vatican archivist, speaking off the record, claimed that the second necropolis was discovered but immediately classified because it contained structures that predated Rome itself. He offered no proof, and shortly after the interview, he retracted the statement, saying he had been mistaken. The tour ends where it began, back up the narrow stairs into the grotto, then up again into the Basilica. You emerge blinking into the light, overwhelmed by what you have seen, but also aware of what you have not. The official narrative is neat. Peter was buried here. The church was built on his grave. The necropolis exists to prove it, but the cracks in that story are visible if you look closely. The sealed passages, the unmarked rooms, the inscriptions that do not fit, and beneath it all, the persistent sense that you have only seen the surface, because the Scavi is not the bottom. Workers know it, archaeologists suspect it, and the Vatican, in its silence, confirms it. There are more levels, more secrets, and as we descend further, the history becomes less clear and the explanations more strained. What was here before the necropolis? What lies beneath the tomb of Peter? And why, after 80 years of excavation, does the Vatican still refuse to show the full map? Before there was St. Peter's Basilica, before there was a necropolis, before there were Christian pilgrims kneeling in reverence, there was a circus. Not a circus in the modern sense, but a Roman one. A massive chariot racing track where thousands gathered to watch horses thunder past, where blood was spilled for entertainment, and where, according to ancient accounts, Christians were executed under the reign of Emperor Nero. That circus, long buried and mostly forgotten, still exists, and it sits directly beneath the Vatican. The Circus of Nero, also called the Circus of Caligula, occupied the ground where St. Peter's now stands. It was built in the 1st century A.D., a sprawling arena stretching over 500 meters long. In the center stood an obelisk brought from Egypt, a symbol of Roman power. Today, that same obelisk stands in the middle of St. Peter's Square, relocated but never replaced. It is the only visible remnant of what lies beneath. Everything else was buried when the Christians took over. Why build a church here, of all places? The official answer is that Peter was martyred in Nero's circus and buried nearby. Early Christians marked the spot, and successive generations built churches on top of it. But there is another reason the church does not emphasize. Building on top of the circus was a statement. It was conquest. The new religion literally burying the old. The site of Christian persecution becoming the center of Christian power. But burial is not the same as destruction, and what was buried has never fully disappeared. When archaeologists excavated beneath the Basilica in the 1940s, they found more than just the necropolis. They found fragments of the circus, stone foundations, sections of wall, and most strikingly, the spina, the central barrier around which chariots raced. Parts of it are still there, incorporated into the foundation of the church above. The Vatican has never publicized this. There are no tours, no markers. The stones that once formed the heart of a pagan arena now support the altar where the Pope celebrates Mass. The symbolism is deliberate, but it is also uncomfortable, because if you dig deeper into the history, the lines between Christian and pagan become harder to draw. Nero's circus was not just a place of entertainment. It was a religious site. The obelisk at its center was sacred to the sun god. Rituals were performed there. Blood sacrifices, dedications to Roman deities. And when the circus was in use, the ground beneath it, the very soil where Christian martyrs were supposedly killed, was considered holy by the Romans. So when Christians built their church on top, they were not simply claiming neutral ground. They were claiming a rival's temple, and in doing so they absorbed more than they destroyed. The evidence is in the architecture. Early Christian churches borrowed heavily from Roman design. The basilica form, the columns, the layout, all came from Roman civic buildings. But they also borrowed symbols. The sun god's halo became the halo of saints. The Roman festival of Sol Invictus, celebrated on December 25th, became Christmas. And the obelisk, that towering symbol of pagan power, was not destroyed. It was reconsecrated, blessed, turned into a Christian monument without changing its form. The Vatican did not erase the past. It repurposed it. But what about the structures themselves? What remains of Nero's Circus beneath the Basilica? The Vatican has never released a complete map. What we know comes from fragmented reports, archaeological journals, and testimonies from workers who helped with excavations. One such worker, speaking decades later, described finding a large vaulted chamber beneath the necropolis that contained remnants of seating. Stone benches tiered like an amphitheater. He asked his supervisor if this was part of the circus. The supervisor told him not to ask questions and to focus on his assigned task. A chamber was not included in any official site plans. There are also the tunnels. Ancient Roman structures were often connected by underground passages, used for moving animals, gladiators, and equipment. Nero's circus would have had them. And if those tunnels still exist, where do they lead? Some researchers believe they connect to other sites across Rome, creating a subterranean network that predates the catacombs. One archaeologist working on a separate excavation near the Tiber River in the 1970s claimed to have found a passage that led toward Vatican Hill. He followed it for nearly 100 meters before encountering a modern steel door, locked and unmarked. When he reported the find, he was told the tunnel was a known maintenance access and not historically significant. But maintenance tunnels are not usually sealed with steel doors that require electronic keypads. Then there is the matter of the altar. The papal altar in St. Peter's Basilica, where only the Pope may celebrate Mass, sits directly above what the Church claims is the tomb of Peter, but it also sits above the former location of the Circus's central obelisk. The obelisk was moved in 1586, a massive engineering feat that took months and required hundreds of workers. But the base, the foundation where it stood for over 1,000 years, was left in place. That foundation, according to historical records, was not just stone. It was a ritual site, a place where offerings were made to the sun god. And now the most sacred spot in Catholicism rests on top of it. Some scholars have suggested that the early Christians chose this site, not despite its pagan significance, but because of it. By building their church on top of a powerful pagan symbol, they were claiming that power for themselves. It was spiritual conquest, but conquest always leaves traces, and those traces, buried beneath marble and gold, still carry meaning. One of the strangest discoveries during the Scavi excavation was a carved stone found near the base of what is believed to be Peter's tomb. The stone was decorated with a mix of Christian and pagan symbols. A cross, yes, but also a sun wheel. A fish, the Christian symbol, but also a serpent coiled around it. The Vatican's archaeologists debated the stone's meaning for years. Some argued it was an early Christian attempt to syncretize, to blend the new faith with old traditions to make conversion easier. Others believed it was evidence of a transitional period where the lines between religions were still blurred. But the stone was never put on public display. It was catalogued and stored, and its location is no longer listed in accessible records. There are also accounts from early Christian writings that complicate the official narrative. St. Jerome, writing in the 4th century, mentioned that Christians in Rome often prayed at sites that had once been sacred to other gods. He did not condemn the practice. He described it as natural, a way of reclaiming holy ground. But he also hinted that some of these sites retained their old power, that the faithful felt something there, something that predated Christ. The Vatican has never emphasized these writings. They do not fit the story of clean conversion, of pagan darkness giving way to Christian light. What is clear is that the ground beneath the Vatican is not simply Christian. It is layered. Roman, pagan, Christian, all stacked on top of each other, each layer leaving its mark. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to separate them. The stones do not remember allegiance. They only remember use. And the circus, that place of blood and spectacle, still shapes the church above it in ways the Vatican does not openly acknowledge. But the circus is not the deepest layer. Workers who helped stabilize the foundations in the 1950s reported finding structures beneath even the circus remains. Stone walls built in a style that predated Rome's imperial period. Foundations that suggested something older, something built before the circus, before the necropolis, before recorded history. When they asked what these structures were, they were told no one knew for certain. And when they asked if further excavation was planned, they were told it was not a priority. The structures were documented, reinforced where necessary, and left untouched. No further questions were entertained that why leave it alone. The official explanation is preservation. Digging deeper risks destabilizing the basilica above. But there is another possibility, that the Vatican knows exactly what is down there and has chosen not to reveal it, because some foundations are better left buried. Some histories are easier to manage when they remain out of sight, and some truths, once uncovered, cannot be controlled. The circus is not a footnote. It is the foundation, and foundations shape everything built on top of them, whether acknowledged or not. The Church stands on the bones of Rome, and Rome, in turn, stands on something even older. There is a tunnel that connects the Vatican to Castel Sant'Angelo, the massive cylindrical fortress that sits less than a kilometer away on the banks of the Tiber River. It is called the Passetto di Borgo, and it is not a secret. Tourists can visit parts of it. Historians write about it. It was built in 1277 as an escape route for popes under threat, and it has been used multiple times throughout history when Rome became too dangerous for the pontiff to remain in the Vatican. Pope Clement VII fled through it in 1527 when the city was sacked. Pope Alexander VI used it to move between the Vatican and his mistress. The tunnel is real, documented, and partially open to the public. But here is what they do not tell you. The Passetto is not the only tunnel, and the others are not on any map. The Passetto runs above ground, built into the medieval wall that once surrounded the Borgo district. It is elevated, fortified, and designed to be defensible. But beneath it, at street level and below, other passages exist. Some are older than the Passetto itself. Some were built later and secret, for reasons the Vatican has never explained. And some, according to workers and historians who have glimpsed them, connect to places far beyond Castel Sant'Angelo. One such passage was discovered by accident in 1937 during routine maintenance beneath the Apostolic Palace. Workers digging to repair a sewage line broke through into a bricked-up tunnel. The tunnel was not on any architectural plan. It was stone, arched, and clearly very old. The workers followed it for about 50 meters before their foreman stopped them and reported the find to Vatican officials. By the next morning, the tunnel entrance had been resealed with concrete, and the workers were reassigned to a different project. No explanation was given. One of those workers, interviewed decades later, said the tunnel had been heading east away from Castel Sant'Angelo toward the center of Rome. Why would the Vatican need secret tunnels? The official explanation, when tunnels are acknowledged at all, is always the same: escape routes. Popes needed ways to flee during sieges, invasions, and periods of civil unrest. That explanation makes sense for the Passetto, but it does not explain tunnels that lead in other directions. It does not explain passages that descend rather than staying at street level. And it does not explain why some of these tunnels are still maintained, their entrances locked with modern security systems. Decades or even centuries after the last siege of Rome, there are accounts, mostly from workers and low-level Vatican employees, of tunnels that connect the Vatican to other significant sites in Rome. One plumber, called in to fix flooding in a subbasement of the Apostolic Palace in the 1980s, described being led through a locked door, down a spiral staircase, and into a long passage lit by bare bulbs. He was told to repair a leak in a section of pipe and not to wander. But he noticed that the tunnel continued far beyond the area he was working in. He asked where it led. His supervisor told him it was not his concern. When he finished the job and returned to the surface, he asked a colleague who had worked at the Vatican for years. The colleague pulled him aside and told him quietly never to ask about the tunnels again. Some things, he said, were not meant to be discussed. Another account comes from a Swiss guard who served in the late 1990s, the Swiss Guard. The small army that protects the Pope and the Vatican has access to areas most employees never see. This particular guard, speaking anonymously years after his service ended, described being assigned to patrol duty in a section of the Vatican he had never been to before. He was given a key card and told to walk a specific route through a basement corridor, checking locked doors at intervals. One of the doors, however, was slightly ajar. Standard protocol was to report any unsecured door immediately, but curiosity got the better of him. He opened it fully and saw a staircase descending into darkness. He called it in over his radio. Within minutes, a superior officer arrived, visibly annoyed, and told him the door should have been locked and that he was not to go down there under any circumstances. The door was secured, and the guard was reassigned the next day. He never saw that corridor again. Then there is the Castel Sant'Angelo itself. The fortress is built on top of the mausoleum of Hadrian, the tomb of a Roman emperor, constructed in the 2nd century A.D. The structure is massive, with multiple levels, dungeons, and papal apartments. It also has tunnels, lots of them. Some connect to the Passetto. Others descend into the foundation, into sections of the old mausoleum that predate the fortress. and a few, according to those who have explored the castle's restricted areas, lead outward beneath the streets of Rome toward destinations that are no longer accessible. One historian who spent years studying Castel Sant'Angelo obtained rare permission to explore some of its sealed lower levels in 2003. He described finding a passage that had been bricked up in the 18th century. The bricks were removed under supervision, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward. He followed it for about 100 meters, accompanied by 2 Vatican security officers, before reaching another brick wall. This one was much older, possibly medieval. He requested permission to continue, but was told the excavation had gone far enough and that structural concerns prevented further exploration. The tunnel was resealed, and his report, submitted to the Vatican, was never made public. Why seal tunnels instead of simply documenting them? The standard answer is safety. Old tunnels collapse. They flood. They are unstable. But modern engineering can stabilize and preserve almost anything if the will and resources are there. The Vatican has both, so the decision to seal rather than explore suggests something else. That what lies at the end of these tunnels is something the Vatican does not want found, or perhaps already knows about and prefers to keep hidden. There are also rumors, persistent and difficult to verify, of tunnels that lead to other churches in Rome. Santa Maria Maggiore, one of the city's 4 major basilicas, is said to be connected to the Vatican by an underground route. The distance is over 3 kilometers. Building such a tunnel would have been a monumental task, but it is not impossible. Rome's catacombs prove that early Christians were capable of extensive underground construction, and if a tunnel was built in secret, perhaps during the medieval period when records were less rigorous, it could have remained hidden for centuries. One priest, serving at Santa Maria Maggiore in the 1970s, claimed to have found a locked door in a storage room beneath the sacristy. The door was heavy iron-bound and set into the stone wall. He had never seen it mentioned in any inventory. When he asked the sacristan about it, the older man told him it was an old entrance to the catacombs, and that it had been sealed for safety. But the priest noticed something odd. The lock on the door was modern. Not a medieval bolt, but a 20th century padlock with a Vatican seal. Why would a sealed catacomb entrance need a new lock? He never got an answer. He left the priesthood a few years later and never returned to investigate. Then there is the question of what these tunnels were used for. Escape routes, certainly, but also smuggling. During periods of political upheaval, the Vatican moved artifacts, documents, and even people through these passages. Some have speculated that during World War II, when Rome was occupied by German forces, the tunnels were used to hide refugees, particularly Jews fleeing persecution. There is some evidence for this. Vatican records confirm that the Church sheltered thousands during the war, but the logistics of hiding that many people in the Vatican itself would have been nearly impossible, unless they were not all kept in the Vatican proper, unless some were hidden in the tunnels, in sealed chambers and forgotten passages where German patrols would never think to look. One elderly Ramon, interviewed in the early 2000s, claimed his father had been part of a resistance group during the war. He said his father once told him about a network of tunnels beneath the city that connected to the Vatican. tunnels where people hid for days or even weeks before being smuggled out of Rome entirely. When asked how his father knew about these tunnels, he said his father had been a stonemason who had worked on Vatican construction projects before the war. He had seen the entrances. He had walked some of the passages, and when the war came, he used that knowledge to save lives. But he never spoke about it publicly, and when he died, the secrets died with him. What is certain is that the Vatican sits on a network of passages that extends far beyond what is publicly known. Some are ancient, some are medieval, and some, based on the presence of modern locks and security systems, are still in use. For what purpose, the Vatican will not say, and those who stumble upon them are quietly discouraged from asking further questions. The Passetto is the decoy, the visible tunnel, the one tourists can visit and feel like they have seen something secret. But the real network lies deeper, threading beneath the streets of Rome like veins beneath skin, connecting the Vatican to places and purposes that remain, even now, deliberately obscure. Not everything buried beneath the Vatican is ancient stone and forgotten tombs. Some of what lies below is far stranger. Objects, artifacts, things that were once displayed in churches, held in private collections, or discovered during excavations and then quietly removed from sight. The Vatican calls it preservation, but those who have seen what is stored in the restricted sections of the basement vaults describe something closer to quarantine. These are not treasures kept safe for future generations. These are things the Church does not want anyone to see. The Vatican has always been a collector. For centuries, popes accumulated art, manuscripts, relics, and curiosities from across the Christian world and beyond. Most of this collection is housed in the Vatican museums, a sprawling complex of galleries that showcases Renaissance masterpieces, ancient sculptures, and priceless religious artifacts. But not everything makes it to the galleries. Some objects are deemed too controversial, too disturbing, or too difficult to explain within the framework of church doctrine. Those objects go elsewhere, down. One of the most well-documented examples is the collection of so-called pagan statues that were removed from public view in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. During the Renaissance and Baroque periods, popes collected Roman and Greek sculptures with enthusiasm, displaying them in the Vatican despite their obviously non-Christian origins. Naked gods, fertility symbols, depictions of myths that had nothing to do with Scripture. For a time this was acceptable. Art was art. History was history. But as the Church's theological stance hardened in the 19th century, particularly under Pope Pius IX, attitudes changed. Nudity became obscene. Pagan imagery became dangerous, and many statues were quietly removed. Some were destroyed. Others were sold. But a significant number were simply moved down into storage areas beneath the museums, out of sight, but not discarded. Why keep them if they were considered inappropriate? Because even the Church understood their historical value, and because destruction would have invited questions the Vatican was not prepared to answer. So the statues were locked away, accessible only to scholars with explicit permission and a compelling academic reason. Even today, researchers who request access to these storage areas report long delays, strict supervision, and the sense that they are being watched. But pagan statues are not the strangest things in the Vatican's hidden collection. There are also objects connected to exorcism. The Vatican's official exorcist, a position that has existed for centuries, maintains records of cases and occasionally confiscates items believed to be connected to demonic possession or occult practices. These objects, crucifixes that allegedly caused harm, books of spells, idols, cursed relics, are not destroyed. They are brought to the Vatican and stored in a secure location. The reasoning is twofold. First, destruction might release whatever spiritual force is attached to the object. Second, the objects serve as evidence, proof that the demonic is real and that the Church's spiritual authority is necessary. Father Gabriel Amorth, the Vatican's chief exorcist from 1986 until his death in 2016, spoke publicly about this collection on several occasions. He described a room deep in the Vatican's restricted areas where confiscated occult objects were kept. He said the room was blessed regularly and that only a handful of people had keys to it. He also said that some of the objects were so disturbing that even he, a man who had performed tens of thousands of exorcisms, refused to handle them directly. When asked what kind of objects, he declined to give specifics, saying only that some things were better left undescribed. One priest who worked with Amorth in the 1990s, speaking anonymously after retiring, described accompanying him to retrieve an object from storage. They descended into a basement level he had never visited before, accessed through a locked door near the Apostolic Penitentiary offices. The hallway beyond was narrow, lined with metal shelving units holding wooden boxes and crates. Amorth selected a specific box, handling it carefully with gloves, and carried it back upstairs without opening it. When the younger priest asked what was inside, Amorth told him it was better not to know, and that curiosity about such things was spiritually dangerous. The priest never saw that storage area again. There are also artifacts that complicate the Church's historical narrative, objects that suggest connections to traditions the Vatican would prefer to disavow. One such object is a collection of Jewish ritual items confiscated during the Spanish Inquisition. Menorahs, Torah scrolls, prayer books, all taken from Jewish families who were forced to convert or face execution. The Vatican held on to these items, not out of respect, but as trophies of forced conversion. For centuries they sat in storage, rarely acknowledged. In recent decades, some have been returned to Jewish communities. But not all. Some remain in Vatican storage, and requests to catalog or return them have been met with bureaucratic delays and vague explanations about provenance and documentation. Then there are the unexplained objects, things that arrived at the Vatican through donations, bequests, or confiscations, and were deemed too strange to display. One archivist working in the 1980s described being asked to catalog a collection of items donated by a deceased cardinal. Among the usual religious artifacts, books, rosaries, vestments, there was a small wooden box containing what appeared to be fragments of bone arranged in a geometric pattern. No label, no explanation. When she asked her supervisor what it was, he told her to catalog it as miscellaneous and not to speculate. The box was moved to restricted storage, and she never saw it again. There are also manuscripts that have been locked away. Not ancient texts, but relatively recent writings that challenge church doctrine or reveal uncomfortable truths. One example is the personal journals of certain popes and cardinals. When a pope dies, his personal papers are supposed to be archived, but not all of them are made accessible to historians. Some are classified, restricted for decades or indefinitely. Why? The official explanation is privacy. But privacy from what? Popes are public figures. Their thoughts on theology, politics, and church governance are historically significant. Unless those thoughts reveal something the Vatican does not want known. One historian researching Pope Pius XII's role during World War II spent years trying to access his personal correspondence. Some files were eventually released, but others remained sealed. When asked why, Vatican officials cited ongoing review processes and sensitivity concerns. But sensitivity to what? If the documents exonerate the Pope, why not release them? If they complicate the narrative, is that not historically important? The selective release suggests that some of what Pius XII wrote does not fit the image the Church wants to project. There is also the matter of forbidden books. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Vatican's official list of banned books, was abolished in 1966, but the books themselves were not destroyed. They were collected and stored in a restricted section of the Vatican Library called the Inferno. Access is still tightly controlled. Scholars must provide detailed justification for why they need to see a specific text, and even then, approval is not guaranteed. What kinds of books are kept there? Some are heretical theological works. Others are early scientific texts that challenged church teaching. A few are occult grimoires and manuals of magic, and some, according to librarians who have worked there, are simply too dangerous to circulate. One researcher granted access to the Inferno in the early 2000s, described finding books that were not just theologically controversial, but physically disturbing. One manuscript, bound in leather that did not look quite like animal hide, contained illustrations that seemed designed to unsettle rather than inform. Another book, printed in the 17th century, was written in a code that had never been fully deciphered. When he asked if he could photograph it for further study, his request was denied. The book, he was told, was too fragile, but he noticed it was in better condition than many other texts in the library that were routinely photographed. Why keep these objects? Why not destroy them or donate them to secular institutions where they could be studied without theological baggage? The answer may be control. As long as the Vatican holds these items, it controls access to them. It controls the narrative around them. And it controls whether they are ever seen again. Because once an object is released into the world, it can be examined, discussed, and interpreted in ways the Church cannot manage. But as long as it sits in a locked vault beneath the Vatican, it remains safely out of reach. The Forbidden Vault is not a single room. It is a concept, a network of storage areas, archive sections, and restricted spaces where the inconvenient and the inexplicable are kept. Some objects are there for preservation, others for suppression, and a few, perhaps, because even the Vatican is not entirely sure what they are or what should be done with them. But all share one thing in common. They were deemed unfit for public eyes, and in the darkness beneath the Basilica they wait. In 1962, the world came within hours of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the United States and Soviet Union to the brink of annihilation. Cities around the globe prepared for the worst. Air raid sirens were tested. Fallout shelters were stocked. And in the Vatican, deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, construction crews worked in secret to ensure that if the world burned, the church would survive. The Vatican bunker is not a myth. It exists. Built during the height of the Cold War, it was designed to protect the Pope and key church officials in the event of a nuclear attack. The project was never announced publicly. No press releases, no official acknowledgement, but construction records later uncovered by Italian journalists confirmed that between 1961 and 1963, a significant underground expansion took place beneath the Apostolic Palace. The stated purpose was utilities and storage, but the scale of the work, the depth of the excavation, and the materials used, reinforced concrete, glass doors, ventilation systems capable of filtering radioactive particles, all pointed to something else. A bunker, a command center, a place designed to outlast the apocalypse. Access to the bunker is among the most restricted in the Vatican. Even high-ranking clergy are not routinely allowed inside. It is maintained by a small team of engineers and security personnel who operate under strict confidentiality agreements. Those who have seen it describe a facility far more extensive than the term bunker suggests. Not just a reinforced room, but a multi-level complex with living quarters, communication equipment, and storage for food and water sufficient to sustain dozens of people for months. Why would the Vatican need such a facility? The official explanation, when the bunker's existence is acknowledged at all, is simple precaution. During the Cold War, Rome was considered a potential target. Italy was a NATO member. The Vatican, while technically neutral, was seen as a symbol of Western civilization. If nuclear war erupted, the Church wanted to ensure continuity of leadership. A pope who survived could offer spiritual guidance in the aftermath. That explanation makes sense on the surface, but it does not explain everything, because the bunker was not just built for survival. It was built for control. One of the first things constructed was a communications hub, radio equipment, encrypted telephone lines. Later, as technology advanced, satellite uplinks. The bunker was designed to allow the Pope to remain in contact with the global church, even if the surface world was in ruins. But communication works both ways, and a facility with that level of connectivity could also serve as a command center, not just for spiritual matters, but for coordinating actions, managing resources, and exerting influence in ways that would be impossible if the Vatican were cut off from the world. One engineer who worked on the bunker's ventilation system in the late 1960s, speaking anonymously decades later, described being taken down a series of staircases that descended far deeper than he had expected. He counted at least 6 levels, each separated by heavy steel doors. The lowest level he was allowed to access was a large room filled with machinery, generators, air filtration systems, and backup power supplies. But he noticed that the staircase continued downward beyond that level. When he asked how deep the complex went, his supervisor told him it was classified and not relevant to his work. He was instructed to install the equipment he had been assigned and not to explore. There are also reports of an emergency exit, a tunnel that leads from the bunker to a location outside Vatican City, possibly surfacing in a nondescript building several blocks away. The logic is sound. A bunker is only useful if you can escape from it when necessary. But if such an exit exists, it has never been publicly disclosed. One former Swiss guard, interviewed years after his service, claimed to have been briefed on evacuation protocols that included a reference to an underground exit route. He was told it was only to be used in the most extreme circumstances and that its location was known only to a select few. He never saw the exit himself, but the briefing made it clear that the Pope would not be trapped underground if the situation required evacuation. What else is stored in the bunker? Food and water, certainly. Medical supplies, but also documents. In the event of a nuclear war, the Vatican would need to preserve its most important records. Theological texts, papal decrees, financial records. But which documents were deemed essential enough to store in a nuclear-proof vault? And were any of those documents already classified? Items that would be lost forever if the surface archives were destroyed? One historian who has studied Vatican record-keeping practices believes that the bunker contains copies of the Church's most sensitive files. Not duplicates kept for preservation, but originals moved there for protection. If true, it would mean that some of the Vatican's deepest secrets are not in the secret archives at all. They are deeper, below even the lowest levels of the library, locked in a facility designed to survive the end of civilization. Then there is the question of who has access. In an emergency, space would be limited. Not everyone could be saved. So who gets in? The Pope, obviously. The cardinals of the Curia, the Church's governing body. Key administrative staff. But what about the thousands of priests, nuns, and lay people who work in Vatican City? What about the Swiss Guard? Are they expected to stand watch on the surface while their leaders retreat underground? And if so, how was that decision justified theologically? One priest who served in the Vatican during the 1980s, speaking off the record, said there was quiet resentment among lower clergy about the bunker. It was seen as evidence that the church hierarchy valued its own survival over the flock it claimed to shepherd. If the world was ending, should not the church be above with the people rather than hiding below? The bunker was not just a Cold War relic. It has been maintained and upgraded. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, one might have expected the facility to be decommissioned. The nuclear threat had diminished. The world seemed safer. But instead, the Vatican continued to invest in the bunker's infrastructure. New communication systems were installed. Structural reinforcements were made. Why? The official answer, when pressed, is that the world remains unstable. Terrorism, regional conflicts, the possibility of a rogue state obtaining nuclear weapons. The bunker remains a necessary precaution, but there is another possibility, that the bunker serves purposes beyond nuclear survival, that it has become a secure location for activities the Vatican does not want monitored or interrupted, high-level meetings that require absolute privacy, decision-making that cannot be leaked or overheard, storage of materials that need to be kept not just secret, but physically isolated from the rest of the Vatican. A bunker designed to survive a nuclear war is also, by definition, impenetrable to almost any form of surveillance or intrusion. That makes it useful even in peacetime. One journalist investigating Vatican finances in the early 2000s received a tip that certain financial records were being stored in a location separate from the official archives. When he asked where, his source said only that it was underground and extremely secure. The journalist pursued the lead but hit a wall. No one at the Vatican would confirm or deny the existence of such a storage location. Requests for information were met with silence. Eventually he moved on to other stories, but the implication remained that the bunker, or something like it, was being used to hide evidence of financial misconduct, not just for protection from external threats, but from internal scrutiny. There are also persistent rumors that the bunker contains a vault within a vault, a secured room inside the facility where the most sensitive materials are kept, not accessible to everyone with bunker clearance, but only to a handful of individuals. What would be kept in such a place? Documents that could bring down the church if released, evidence of crimes that have never been prosecuted, artifacts that contradict official doctrine, or perhaps something simpler and more pragmatic, leverage, information that can be used to control, coerce, or protect against external enemies. The bunker represents a troubling truth, that the Vatican, for all its spiritual rhetoric, is deeply invested in temporal survival. It has planned for the worst. It has built infrastructure to outlast disaster, and in doing so, it has created a space where secrecy is absolute. Because unlike the archives above, where historians can eventually request access, the bunker has no such mechanisms. It is not a place of scholarship or transparency. It is a fortress within a fortress. And what happens inside its walls, what is stored in its deepest chambers, may never be known to anyone outside the small circle of those who hold the keys. The Cold War is over, but the bunker remains, maintained, upgraded, and ready. For what exactly the Vatican will not say, and that silence speaks louder than any explanation ever could. Rome is famous for its catacombs, miles of underground tunnels where early Christians buried their dead, carved chapels into rock, and hid during persecution. The most well-known, the catacombs of Calixtus and San Sebastiano, are tourist destinations. Guided tours lead visitors through narrow passages lined with burial niches, past faded frescoes of early Christian symbols, and into chambers where the bones of martyrs once rested. But those are the mapped catacombs, the explored ones, the ones the Church has opened to the public because they tell a story the Vatican once told. Beneath the Vatican itself there are others, catacombs that do not appear on any map, passages that were sealed centuries ago and have remained closed ever since. And the question is not whether they exist, it is what lies inside them. The existence of unmapped catacombs beneath Vatican City has been suspected since the 19th century. Early archaeologists working in Rome noted that the known catacomb networks did not extend as far as Vatican Hill, which seemed strange. The hill was inhabited in ancient times. Christians lived there. They would have needed burial spaces. So where are their catacombs? The assumption was that they had been destroyed or built over when St. Peter's Basilica was constructed. But there were hints, references in old church documents, accounts from medieval pilgrims that suggested some of these catacombs still existed. just not where anyone could access them. In 1893, a maintenance crew working in the cellars of the Apostolic Palace broke through a wall and found themselves staring into a dark tunnel. The passage was carved into bedrock, ancient and unmistakably part of a catacomb network. The crew reported the discovery, and Vatican officials arrived quickly. The tunnel was examined briefly, then sealed with brick and plaster. No excavation was authorized. No further investigation took place. One of the workers, writing in his personal journal years later, said the tunnel had stretched into darkness beyond the reach of their lanterns, and that he had seen burial niches carved into the walls. He also said he had felt an overwhelming sense of unease and had been relieved when the decision was made to seal it. Why seal it? The official explanation, repeated whenever such discoveries are mentioned, is structural integrity. Opening old catacombs can destabilize foundations. Water seepage is a problem. Collapses are possible. All of this is true, but it does not explain why the Vatican routinely seals these passages without documenting what is inside them. Modern archaeological techniques allow for safe exploration. Ground-penetrating radar, fiber-optic cameras, structural reinforcement. If the Church wanted to explore these catacombs, it could. The fact that it does not suggests a deliberate choice. There are other accounts. In 1947, during the excavation of the necropolis beneath St. Peter's, workers reported finding a passage that did not lead to the main burial street, but instead descended at a sharp angle into what appeared to be a much older network of tunnels. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and the air coming from it was cold and damp. One worker volunteered to explore it with a rope tied around his waist. He descended about 20 meters before the rope went slack. When his colleagues pulled him back up, he was pale and refused to speak about what he had seen. He quit the job the next day. The passage was sealed with concrete, and no record of it appears in the official excavation reports. What could have frightened him so badly? There are several possibilities. The most benign is that he encountered structural instability, loose rock, or flooding, and feared for his safety. But there are darker rumors that he found remains, not ancient skeletons in burial niches, but something else, bodies that were not placed there in the early Christian period, more recent. One theory, whispered among those who study Vatican history, is that some of the sealed catacombs were used as dumping grounds for inconvenient corpses, heretics, enemies of the Church, people who disappeared and were never meant to be found. There is no proof of this, but there are gaps in the historical record. People who vanished during the Inquisition or the Renaissance and were never accounted for. And the Vatican has never fully opened its archives on those periods. Then there is the question of what else might be hidden in the catacombs. Early Christians did not just bury bodies. They also hid texts. During periods of persecution, when Roman authorities were destroying Christian writings, believers would hide manuscripts in sealed niches within the catacombs. Some of these texts have been found in the public catacombs. Fragments of Gospels, early theological writings. But if texts were hidden in the catacombs beneath the Vatican, texts that challenged orthodoxy or revealed uncomfortable truths about the early Church, would the Vatican publish them? Or would they remain sealed? One researcher who has studied early Christian Burial Practices believes that the catacombs beneath the Vatican contain texts that were deliberately hidden by church authorities in later centuries, not during Roman persecution, but during the formation of the biblical canon. Gospels that were excluded, letters from apostles that contradicted official doctrine. These texts would have been too important to destroy but too dangerous to keep accessible, so they were placed in sealed tombs and passages that were then closed and forgotten, until excavations in the 20th century began to rediscover them. And when that happened, the Vatican's response was not exploration but closure. Seal the passage, forbid access. Let the texts remain hidden. There are also architectural mysteries. In several locations beneath the Vatican, workers have encountered walls that are clearly not original to the structures around them. They are newer, built with different materials, and designed to block passages that once connected to larger networks. Why wall off sections of catacombs? The Church claims it is to prevent collapse or flooding, but in some cases the walls are more elaborate than necessary for simple structural support. Reinforced, multiple layers, and in at least one instance, according to a worker who helped build such a wall in the 1960s, the bricks were blessed by a priest before being laid. Why bless a wall unless you believe there is something on the other side that requires spiritual protection? One of the strangest accounts comes from a Vatican employee who worked in the archives in the 1980s. She was researching medieval records of construction projects and came across a document dated 1623. It described repairs to the foundations of St. Peter's and mentioned that during the work a passage was discovered leading to the old catacombs where the heretics are buried. The document went on to say that the passage was sealed on the orders of Pope Urban VIII and that no one was to enter it, lest the errors of the past be disturbed. She made a note of the document's catalog number and planned to return to it later. But when she went back, the document was missing. The catalog entry still existed, but the file itself was empty. When she inquired, she was told it had been moved to a restricted section for conservation purposes. She requested access. The request was denied. She left the Vatican shortly afterward and never learned what happened to the document. What were the errors of the past that Pope Urban VIII was so concerned about? Heretical texts? Forbidden teachings? Or simply evidence that the early church was far more divided and chaotic than official history admits? The catacombs are places of memory, and memory for an institution that claims unbroken continuity and doctrinal purity can be dangerous, because the catacombs remember a time when Christianity was not unified, when multiple versions of the faith competed, when texts that are now labeled heretical were once read and revered by believers who considered themselves just as Christian as those who followed the emerging orthodoxy. The decision to seal the catacombs is a decision to control that memory, to ensure that the past remains fixed, that the narrative stays clean, and that uncomfortable questions are never raised. Because once you start exploring the catacombs, once you open the sealed passages and read the hidden texts, the story becomes complicated. The lines blur, and the authority of the institution, built on the claim of unbroken truth, begins to crack. Modern technology could map these catacombs without ever opening them. Ground-penetrating radar, sonar imaging, techniques that could reveal the full extent of the network, identify what lies in the sealed chambers, and do so without risking structural damage. But the Vatican has never authorized such a project. When researchers have proposed it, they are told that the technology is too intrusive or that the cost is prohibitive. But the real cost, perhaps, is knowledge. Because once the map is drawn, once the catacombs are revealed, the Church will have to explain why they were sealed in the first place. And some explanations are harder to give than others. The catacombs are not just burial grounds. They are archives, living history carved into stone. And what they contain, what they remember, is a version of the past that the Vatican has spent centuries trying to bury, not with persecution or fire, but with silence. And in the darkness beneath the Basilica, that silence holds. There is a number that appears in whispered conversations among Vatican workers, 12, not a reference to the apostles or a symbolic biblical figure, but a depth measurement. 12 levels beneath the surface, 12 floors down. Some who have worked on construction and maintenance projects beneath the Vatican claim the structure descends that far. Others say it goes deeper still. But 12 is the number that appears most often, and it is the level that no one admits to having seen in full. The concept of level 12 first surfaced in the testimonies of construction workers, hired during various excavation and reinforcement projects throughout the 20th century. These were not Vatican employees. They were contractors brought in for specific jobs, paid well, and required to sign strict confidentiality agreements. Most honored those agreements, but a few years or even decades later spoke, not to journalists or researchers, but to family, friends, people they trusted. And their accounts, though separated by time and circumstance, share troubling similarities. One electrician, hired in 1958 to install wiring in newly excavated sections beneath the Apostolic Palace, described descending a series of staircases that seemed to go on forever. He counted the levels as he went down. 1, 2, 3. By the time he reached the area where he was supposed to work, he had counted 11. But he noticed that the staircase continued downward beyond where he stopped. When he asked his foreman how deep the structure went, the foreman told him it was not his concern and to focus on his assignment. Later, during a break, he asked one of the Vatican's own maintenance workers the same question. The man looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, 12, maybe more. But no one talks about the bottom. What is on level 12? No one will say officially, but the accounts from those who claim to have been there or close to it describe a space unlike the levels above. The upper levels, the grotto, the scavi, the tunnels, all feel ancient but recognizable. Stone corridors, burial chambers, spaces that make sense within the context of history and architecture. But the deeper you go, the stranger it becomes. Workers describe sections where the stone is cut with a precision that does not match medieval or even Roman techniques. Walls that are perfectly smooth, corners that meet at exact right angles, and chambers that are too large, too empty, to have any obvious purpose. One engineer, brought in during the 1970s to assess structural stability, in the deepest accessible levels, described being taken down to what he was told was level 10. But as he worked, he noticed that the floor beneath him was not solid bedrock. It was poured concrete, recent concrete. When he mentioned this to his Vatican liaison, he was told it was part of a modernization effort. But modernization for what? If this was simply foundation reinforcement, why would the floor need to be poured at this depth? He began to suspect that the concrete was not a foundation, but a seal. That something below had been deliberately covered over. He did not voice his suspicion, but later, as he was preparing to leave, he noticed a service elevator he had not seen before. It was older than the stairwells, industrial, the kind used to move heavy equipment. He asked where it led. His liaison hesitated, then said it was for maintenance access only and not part of his assignment. The engineer let it go, but as he was packing his tools, he saw 2 Vatican workers enter the elevator with a steel cart carrying several sealed containers. The elevator descended, and when he glanced at the panel, he saw buttons for 12 levels. 12. Not 10, where he had been working. 12. What could require an industrial elevator at that depth? The most practical answer is storage. Food, water, supplies for the bunker. Equipment that needs to be moved in bulk. But the containers he saw were not labeled. They were sealed with heavy locks, and the workers handling them wore gloves and moved with a carefulness that suggested the contents were either valuable or dangerous. When the engineer asked casually what was being transported, he was told it was classified materials and that he should finish his work and leave. He did, and he never returned to the Vatican. Then there are the rumors of experiments. These are harder to verify, existing mostly in second-hand accounts and unconfirmed testimonies. But the pattern is consistent. Vatican researchers, scientists brought in under conditions of secrecy, working on projects that are never published or discussed publicly. One such account comes from a chemist who claims to have been contracted by the Vatican in the 1980s to analyze samples of organic material. He was never told where the samples came from. He was given a lab space in a building adjacent to Vatican City and instructed to conduct his analysis without asking questions. The samples were unusual. Preserved tissue that appeared ancient but showed signs of intentional chemical treatment, beyond anything used in historical embalming practices. He completed his analysis and submitted his report. He was paid, thanked, and told his services were no longer needed. When he later tried to follow up, his contact at the Vatican claimed no knowledge of the project. His report, which he had kept a copy of, disappeared from his files. He suspects his office was searched, though he has no proof. Why would the Vatican need to analyze ancient tissue? The most benign explanation is that it was related to relic authentication. The Church has thousands of relics, fragments of bone and cloth, attributed to saints. Testing them would be reasonable. But why the secrecy? Why hire an outside contractor rather than use Vatican researchers? And why make the results vanish? Unless the analysis revealed something the Church did not want known. That the relics were fraudulent. Or worse, that they were real but dated to a time or place that contradicts official history. There are also accounts of rooms at the deepest levels that are not storage, or labs but something else entirely. Spaces that feel ceremonial. One worker, hired in the early 1990s to install ventilation ducts, described being led down to what he believed was level 11 or 12. The staircase ended in a wide corridor lined with doors. Most were locked, but one was open, and as he passed, he glanced inside. The room was circular, perhaps 20 meters in diameter, with a domed ceiling. The walls were covered in symbols he did not recognize. Not Christian, not Roman, something older. In the center of the room was a raised platform, smooth and unmarked. He asked his guide what the room was for. The guide told him it was an old storage space no longer in use. But the room did not look like storage. It looked like a place designed for gathering, for ritual. He did not press further, but the image stayed with him. Years later, he tried to research the symbols he had seen, drawing them from memory. A historian he consulted told him they resembled pre-Christian religious markings, possibly Etruscan or even older. But without photographs or precise measurements, identification was impossible. Why would a pre-Christian ritual chamber exist beneath the Vatican? One possibility is that it was there first, that the Christians built on top of it, just as they built on top of the Necropolis and Nero's Circus. But if so, why preserve it? Why not destroy or bury it completely? Unless it serves a purpose, unless the Vatican, despite its outward rejection of pagan traditions, understands that some places hold power regardless of the symbols carved into their walls. There is one more detail that appears in multiple accounts. A sound. Workers who have descended to the lowest levels report hearing something. Not voices, not machinery. A hum. Low, almost subaudible, felt more than heard. Some describe it as unsettling. Others say it is strangely calming. One worker said it reminded him of the way old cathedrals feel during a silent mass, as if the air itself is charged with something unspoken. But this was not a cathedral. It was deep underground, far from any church, any altar, any congregation. So where was the sound coming from? And why did it exist at all? The Vatican has never released architectural plans for the deepest levels. Requests from historians and researchers are met with the same response. The information is restricted for security and structural reasons. But security from what? And what structural concerns would be compromised by revealing the layout of empty storage rooms? The refusal to provide basic information suggests that what lies on level 12 is not empty. And it is not simple. The testimonies are fragmented. The evidence is circumstantial, but the pattern is clear. The Vatican descends far deeper than it admits. And at the bottom, or near it, there are spaces that do not fit the official narrative. Rooms that predate Christianity, laboratories conducting secret research, storage areas containing objects the Church will not name, and perhaps, in the deepest chambers, something else entirely, something that has been there longer than the Basilica, longer than the Church, longer than any institution built by human hands, waiting in the dark. There is a difference between what is hidden and what is forbidden. Hidden things can eventually be found. Archives open. Documents surface. Time erodes secrecy. But forbidden things exist in a different category. They are not merely locked away. They are protected, guarded. And the mechanisms of that protection reveal just as much as the things being hidden. Because when an institution refuses to show something, even when pressed by historians, journalists, and its own faithful, that refusal is itself a confession. It says this matters, and it says you cannot know why. The Vatican is not unique in having secrets. Every government, every corporation, every institution with power and history holds information it does not release. But what makes the Vatican different is the moral authority it claims. It positions itself as the guardian of truth. It tells believers that faith and truth are inseparable. And yet, when it comes to what lies beneath its foundations, when it comes to the deepest chambers and the oldest objects, and the maps that show just how far down the structure goes, the response is always the same. No, not for you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Why? The standard explanations, preservation, structural concerns, security ring hollow after a certain point. Because preservation requires documentation. You cannot preserve what you have not catalogued. And yet the Vatican refuses to catalog large sections of what lies beneath. Structural concerns can be addressed with modern engineering. Ground-penetrating radar does not require digging. Fiber optic cameras do not require demolition. These technologies exist and are used routinely at archaeological sites around the world, but not beneath the Vatican. And security from what? From whom? The only people asking for access are scholars, historians, and researchers whose work depends on evidence, not speculation. They are not a threat, unless the threat is not to the structure, but to the narrative, because narratives require consistency. The story the Vatican tells about itself, an unbroken line of apostolic succession, a church built on the rock of Peter, a faith unchanged since Christ, depends on certain things being true. It depends on Peter being buried exactly where the church says he is. It depends on the Basilica being built purely for spiritual reasons, not political ones. It depends on the Christian triumph over paganism being total, not partial. And it depends on the foundations being solid metaphorically and literally. But the deeper you go, the less solid those foundations appear, the more the story fractures. And that is what cannot be shown. Take the question of Peter's tomb. The church claimed certainty. Excavations in the 1940s found bones. Pope Paul VI declared them authentic in 1968. Case closed. But even Vatican archaeologists have admitted, in private, that the evidence is not conclusive. The bones were not found where tradition said they would be. They were mixed with other remains. Carbon dating placed them in the right time period, but that only proves they are old, not whose they are. And yet the Church cannot afford ambiguity here, because if Peter is not beneath St. Peter's, then the entire justification for the Vatican's location, its authority, its claim to be the center of Christianity, collapses. So ambiguity is not allowed. The bones are Peter's. The discussion is over. And the deeper chambers, the ones that might contain contradictory evidence, remain sealed, or consider the tunnels. The Vatican acknowledges the Passetto. It is visible. It is historical. But it will not acknowledge the others, the tunnels that lead in different directions, the passages that connect to unknown locations. Why? Because once you admit those tunnels exist, you have to explain where they go. And that invites questions the Vatican cannot answer without revealing things it has worked for centuries to hide. Where do the tunnels lead? To other churches, to private estates, to government buildings. And what was moved through them? People, certainly, but also objects, documents, money, things that needed to travel unseen, unrecorded, unaccountable. The tunnels are not just escape routes. They are veins of power, and mapping them would reveal a network of influence that extends far beyond the spiritual. Then there are the objects, the artifacts stored in restricted vaults, the banned books, the confiscated relics, the items connected to exorcisms. Why keep them if they are dangerous? Why not destroy them? The Church's explanation is that destruction risks releasing spiritual forces. But that explanation only makes sense if you accept the premise that the objects are genuinely dangerous. And if they are, then why keep them at all? Why not perform an exorcism on the object itself and neutralize it? Unless the real reason has nothing to do with demons. Unless the objects are kept because they have value. Not spiritual value, but evidentiary value. They prove something. Something that, if revealed, would challenge the Church's teachings or expose its history in uncomfortable ways. So they are locked away, not from demons, but from scrutiny. The bunker is another example. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union fell decades ago. Nuclear war, while still a risk, is no longer the existential threat it was in the 1960s. So why maintain a nuclear bunker? Why continue to upgrade it? Why install new communication systems and reinforce its structures? The official answer is precaution. But precaution for what scenario? Exactly? The world is more connected now, more transparent, more difficult to control through secrecy. A bunker designed to survive nuclear war is also a place where decisions can be made without oversight, where meetings can be held without record, where actions can be coordinated without accountability. That utility does not expire when the threat changes. It only becomes more valuable. And finally, there is level 12, or whatever the deepest point actually is. Workers describe it. Engineers hint at it. Former employees mention it in passing. But the Vatican will not confirm it, will not deny it, will not discuss it at all. Why? Because acknowledging it would require explaining it, and explaining it would require revealing its purpose. Storage? For what? Research into what? Ritual space? For whom? Every answer leads to another question, and the Vatican has decided that the safest response is silence. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of control. Silence that says we know, and we have decided you do not need to. What is the cost of that silence? For the faithful, it is confusion. Why does the Church, which preaches transparency and truth, refuse to be transparent about its own foundations? Why does it guard its history with the same secrecy it condemns in secular governments? For historians, it is frustration. Evidence is buried, literally. Primary sources are sealed. Access is denied, and the picture of the past remains incomplete, distorted by gaps that the Vatican could fill but chooses not to. And for the institution itself, the cost is credibility. Because every refusal to show, every deflection, every door that stays locked, reinforces the suspicion that there is something to hide. And once that suspicion takes root, it spreads. But perhaps the Vatican has made a calculation that the cost of revelation is higher than the cost of secrecy. that whatever lies in the deepest chambers, whatever is stored in the forbidden vaults, whatever truths are buried beneath the basilica, would do more damage if known than if hidden. And maybe they are right. Maybe some of what lies beneath would shatter faith, would rewrite history, would force the Church to confront contradictions it has spent 2,000 years avoiding. Or maybe the truth is simpler, that the Vatican, like every institution with deep roots and long memory, has accumulated so many secrets over so many centuries that it no longer knows how to untangle them, that the layers of concealment have become so thick, so interwoven, that revealing one thing would unravel everything. So the doors stay locked. The tunnels remain unmapped. The deepest levels are neither confirmed nor explained. And the narrative, however fragile, however contested, holds, not because it is true, but because the alternative, admitting uncertainty, acknowledging gaps, allowing access, is unthinkable. The Vatican's power has always rested on the claim that it knows, that it holds the keys, literally and figuratively, to truth. And that claim cannot survive transparency, because transparency reveals what every old institution eventually must face. That certainty is an illusion, that foundations crack, and that what lies beneath is not always what we were told. The Vatican will not show you what is under St. Peter's, not all of it, not the parts that matter most. And the reason is not preservation or security or structural concern. The reason is simpler and more human than that. Fear. Fear that the truth, whatever it is, will change everything. And maybe it would. Or maybe it would just confirm what many already suspect, that the Church, for all its grandeur and authority, is built on the same unstable ground as every other human institution. Ambition, compromise, and the slow accumulation of things we were never supposed to see. What lies beneath the Vatican is not just stone and bone and buried history. It is a question the Church refuses to answer. And in that refusal, in that silence, the answer becomes clear. Whatever is down there, it is not meant for us. Not now, not yet. And perhaps, if the Vatican has its way, not ever.